I think this supports my comments around having to be thoughtful and strategic about where we increase active jurisdiction or other regulations. I think we need to do it in a way that's gonna be effective and additive. And if that requires an investment in more better mapping, that's okay. I don't think we wanna just do things in a scattershot way where we're gonna have to put all these resources to identifying things that frankly, we may not need to. So I think you're right in assuming that the capacity is limited, that we're relying more and more on those sorts of maps and tools. And that at some point, we're gonna need to think about the hierarchy of importance of like where we really need to put our efforts, which ones can we focus on that may open up or protect other resources without having to map them, for instance.
Well, for instance, fair amount, not all of which I've retained, about the complexity of mapping, remapping river corridors, floodplains, adjacent wetlands, at what level of granularity, and how far of a watershed, and seems like there's a lot. Okay, that's it for me. Any other questions for Mr. Jones? Thank you very much. Mr. Gregory, my apologies, I misread the batting order, so you were really in the chair at the right time, but.
You have the
chair,
the luxury of misreading and getting one out of the way with. No problem whatsoever. For the record, my name is Peter Gregory. I work as director of the Two Rivers Ottauquechee Regional Commission. I work for 30 small towns in northern Windsor, most of Orange County, 2 Addison County towns, and 1 Rutland County town. So thank you very much for inviting me here today, and thank you for this committee's interest in taking up Act 250 early and robustly. I think it's appropriate for this committee to be involved in this issue in a strong way. I was a member of the NRB effort, as I think the Regional Planning Commission represented. I was pleased to be part of that. I just want to echo what Billy Coster says. The process was well run, good consultants. I felt that all folks had opportunity to weigh in, and I think the result was a good framework, a good start, and that's where it was. The recommendations that came out of that study recognized that there's a sound basis for those decisions and recommendations, and that's planning and data rather than politics and arbitrary decision making. Unlike, I think, in my first review of 719, which they never come over, this has got some meat behind it, and that meat is, like I said, the planning and data. And that's really coming from the future land use study from the regional planning commissions, and that was a study that the regional planning commissions asked the legislature to direct us to do. And that was intent on ensuring that all the regional planning commissions land use mapping and text descriptions of land use areas, whether they be the settled areas or the natural resource areas, are consistent so that we would have a foundation on which to build from the designation study, which is kind of the incentive program that we're talking about, and the NRB study, which is the regulatory portion. This land use study really, of course, I'm biased, I think is the most important because it is the foundation. There's some basis, and it is done in cooperation with our municipalities. So it is an inclusive process that we have been doing for over 50 years, but we are with your help, are going to step up the game, and we will work with you to provide details on how to put appropriate timelines on our work so this all works out, appropriate accountability, do our work, and consequences if we're not doing it as we should. But I'm confident we will.
Can you just say a little bit about the mapping we've already been doing and how that sort of segues into this newer mapping effort? Well, because you're doing mapping projects regularly.
Exactly. Our regional plan, which is required to be consistent with the goals and adopted by our boards, which are made up of municipalities, is required to map settled areas and natural resources and transportation facilities. So that's already in statute. What we're doing is making sure that the mapping we're doing as far as settled areas, the tier 1s and 2s, the planned growth areas, as we call them. Again, this is a planning exercise. Something we've been doing all along, but it will be improved and consistent across the state. The mapping of natural resources and the policy decisions you make on which resources are the ones that we ought to be mapping. We will need the help of the Agency of Natural Resources, and Billy was clear that they've got the expertise on the data and the knowledge to help us do that on a consistent basis statewide. So we look forward to their participation in that effort with our communities. So I really believe the regional land use mapping and planning we do takes the place of the land capability and development plan. I mean, no plan would have any kind of standing if it comes from Montpelier or Waterbury. This is what we do. We do planning at the local and regional level, the sub-state level. So this is an opportunity to invigorate and improve our planning to serve the state's regulatory function and designation program. So we're very excited about the opportunity. We do view these studies as a package. However, they're kind of fleshed out and they're just skeletons. And we will be working with anybody and everyone on a land use mapping implementation timelines and structure to help pull it. We would like to be legislatively directed to do our work. We would like the timelines. We want them to be fast but reasonable so that we can make progress on regulatory reform. And we want accountability. We need accountability in all stages of this effort. So I just want to be brief on this, Mr. Chair. But I would say this is an opportunity I have not seen in my career to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of using our resources in our communities. A chance to expand jurisdiction on natural resources that deserve more protection. And to also make some progress in curbing sprawl. Commercial retail sprawl, which is killing our downtowns. As the state continues to dump tax revenues into communities for downtown programs. And we have communities that allow sprawl to happen. That can't continue. So we want to work with you to make the system work better. And I think I see a coalition of people that want to help make this happen. So.
Our general.
Yeah, the
I need
90s,
instant support, right?
Oh, yeah, I love the job in general, yeah.
Yankee sprawl is like 90,
No.
sorry, we went down with a field trip to Rutland, to be specific, and years ago, like 8 years ago. And it was, at the local level, it was incredibly unpopular, at least for the people we connect with. So how is that playing out in terms of helping avoid sprawl, script development now?
Yeah.
And how would this maybe do better?
Well, changing 9L was the right thing to do. I'm sure it was unpopular, but good public policy isn't always a popular contest, and I think it was the right thing to do. I don't believe personally it was as detailed as it needed to be, but that can be a discussion for another day. There still is sprawl that happens underneath Act 250, outside of Act 250 jurisdiction. I think this proposal to have regional planning commissions with our communities designate boundaries for the settled areas, which are larger than the designated areas, villages and downtowns, that accommodate some additional growth of all kinds in safe areas is really the key to controlling sprawl. And so inside, if you've got stormwater capacity, you've got bylaws that do need to be reviewed by somebody to make sure they're good. And then the administrative capacity, you should be given a strong green light. There's sewer capacity that it's a waste of resources that it's not being used. Beyond that, I think some of the suggestions about the road rule and increased jurisdiction on natural resources of statewide significance would also help on this problem.
Have we ever drawn a line around, makes me think of Portland, Oregon, where there's a development area, and then there's this deep line, and development outside that is handled in a very different way.
Well, in my region, the Two Rivers region, we have done that with our downtowns and villages and we have policies that prohibit retail sprawl outside of those boundaries and have been very active in Act 250 in containing that and preventing retail sprawl, which really kills the downtowns. We have not done that on housing. Politically, it would have been too difficult, but also, we've got this need for housing, that would prevent us from being too rigorous as far as housing, but, those boundaries have been on the books in our regional plan and used in Act 250 for a couple of decades to good success.
So I was down in the Berkshires this fall and I did a big loop. The first half loop was down Route 7, everyone's favorite road. And it was sort of a predictable Route 7 experience, we've developed, but the main traffic artery. The loop back was on smaller back roads and I went 25 miles before I came back to 7. And it was almost continual houses, every 200 yards or something all the way along. So it was like a forested suburb. It never didn't matter when you went from one town to the next and sort of never broke drive, just continual. And it, whatever. So it just made me a little sad to think I'd hate to see Vermont lose that rhythm and faith in, develop and natural spaces, and as opposed to slicing everything up all the way along all our roads. And these were not major roads, they were back roads. A lamentation on my part. I just hope it's not our future and then figure it out a little better than that.
I share your concern.
Sarah Watson, do you have a question?
I did have a question, the sprawl that you're seeing that is allowed under Act 250 currently, are those one-off instances, or is that systematic as allowed by Act?
Well, I think it's, in some cases, it's systematic. I mean, it's just the thresholds we have and the 1 acre, 10 acre issue, and we have communities in my region that have adopted subdivision and zoning just to get outside under Act 250 and are involved in containing sprawl. I don't believe that's probably the only community that's done that in the state, so yeah, but it's not just a mistake here and there, it's a system that needs to be reevaluated and changed.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do you have a concern that as we move jurisdictional thresholds up, it will just have larger developments that are just sub-jurisdictional?
I assume that's gonna happen, but I think certainly in the built up areas, the planned growth areas, that's where we want it, so we're not gonna have those thresholds or jurisdictional limits to hop over. That's where we want it to go.
Okay, they turn out to be not actually a school for community. All right, there are no other committee questions for Mr. Gregory. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
Next, Ms. Sullivan. Good morning, thank you for coming in.
Good morning, Mary Sullivan, Vice President of Government Affairs for the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. I am not often in this committee, so I'm just going to take a minute to explain who we are. The Vermont Chamber of Commerce is the state's largest statewide business organization. We are friendly and cooperative with the 30 other chambers of commerce in the state, but the difference is that we operate in the statewide level. Most of the other regional local chambers operate within their region or their location. We, likely share a mission of advancing the Vermont economy. The statewide chamber does it through advocacy and our work in this building, and your local chambers may do it through things like festivals and networking events. So that's sort of outlines who we are and what, if familiar with chambers, but the difference between the statewide chamber and regional chambers.
Well, it's good to have you in here. Usually I see you in finance.
I was gonna say, I definitely see some of you next door in the afternoons. So Act 250 is something that the state chamber has been engaged on for many years before I joined the chamber. And so when we were asked to be on the steering committee, it was an opportunity not just to talk about what we see in this building, the conversations we have at this building, but to really sit at the table, push up our sleeves and have real conversations with other stakeholders about where are the areas that we can really move forward on priorities for Vermont. For the Vermont Chamber members, our workforce crisis is a huge problem. Businesses all over the state at all income levels are struggling to find employees. There are more job openings than there are people on unemployment and graduating seniors combined. You need more people, you need a diversity of people to be calling Vermont home. And our employers often talk about the hardest part that they have in retaining and attracting new employees is housing. That employees just can't find the appropriate housing for them or their families, or if they're older employees that are looking to downsize, that they can't also find those opportunities. So it's not just about building single family homes. It's also about how we incorporate our seniors and how we're inviting diversity into the state.
And so thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, a quick question. So often when I'm having conversations with folks about the housing crisis, they're always talking to me about building more single family homes as opposed to multi-family units, apartment buildings, condos, et cetera, other forms of helping people have quality housing.
Absolutely.
And is that part of your mix so that the
Absolutely.
housing piece doesn't overly drive the whole conversation?
Yeah, I think that's the focus of the missing middle housing. The missing middle piece are the condos, the townhouses, the multi-unit buildings that can fit into our regional community centers where that 50-unit building that may look okay in South Burlington is not going to fit the character of writing, but that missing middle, as it's supposed to be used as a building term of the various types of housing that could be a duplex, a triplex, are important. Last year, we did an op-ed about Vermont's housing crisis with AARP and with the Vermont Professionals of Color Network to highlight that this is a problem for all types of housing, for all types of people. So Senator McCormick, when you brought up Bud and Ivy, I've already forgotten their names, I'm sorry. Bucky and Iva. What is, how are they doing? I would say Bucky and Iva have reached a point in their life where they're saying, I love my community, I want to stay here, I want to live here. But I can't live in my 3-4 bedroom home with 3 floors. Are there options for me to downsize and still be part of my community and maybe be able to go to my community doctor and go to my pharmacy and go to the grocery store without having to drive for miles? And I think a lot of times we're saying, no, there isn't that opportunity, and that's what we're trying to create, because we need to make sure that all Vermonters have a home here, whether they're new Vermonters or they're sage Vermonters. That we can provide that opportunity. So I think that is one of the solutions we're trying to create. So the compromise that we reached in this report, I know you've heard some of the details, but I will say it is looked at as a package report. That the pieces that have been compromised on here aren't meant to be an a la carte menu. We'll take the road rule, but we'll leave out further shifting. I like that idea that we're not eliminating permitting. We're saying there are other entities who are doing this level of permitting rather than duplicate that effort. We're gonna have it done once and reduce the costs that are then added to each unit. That's really part of the overall package. I think Senator Watson, you summed it up very well about what is the problem we're trying to solve. DHFA outlined in the housing needs assessment that we need 40,000 more units of housing. That is going to be updated this June. We'll see how those numbers have changed. The Vermont Futures Project, looking at not only what do we need for our current residents, but if we want to have a growing, vibrant population, we actually need closer to 80,000 units of housing by 2035. And so while there's the stories of the real impacts of Act 250, I think we could all probably say there are reputational issues that people are trying to avoid going through it. So we can reach those 40,000 or 80,000 units by saying, we're just gonna build 9 units throughout the countryside, which can lead to, I think, Senator Bray, what you were talking about, this never-ending roads of houses without carefully considered compact development patterns. And so the compromise here is to say, let's encourage and incentivize housing where we want it. Now, Act 250, I will be the first to admit, is not a silver bullet that is going to solve the housing crisis. It is one of the pieces that we need to look at and update to encourage housing where we want it, and discourage the third of a mile driveway that is currently not being reviewed to the mansion. That's the compromise. Let's build 40,000 units of housing where we want them. And if someone is building one house up a long driveway, we're gonna review that. And I think that's probably the intention behind Act 250, but is not currently what is happening. So by saying, if you want to build in this tier 2 area, it's not no, but we're gonna review it. And if you build in a compact way, so on a shorter road that has less impact on our forests, and you're building under 9 units, you still are under that threshold, but it better be compact. So that we're not seeing this sort of long driveway creep into our forested areas.
So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding.
Yeah,
So you're saying that for tier 2 areas, which is the vast majority of the land in Vermont.
right, undeveloped lands and important.
Exactly, you're saying that we actually might see a higher degree of scrutiny than what we currently have under Act 250.
Absolutely. Yeah, without question. Under this compromise, it would be a higher degree of scrutiny
Yes.
because we're adding a road rule. That's the compromise. We add the road rule to say, instead of building your 9 units within 5 miles that each have a long driveway and each go to a large house, you can still build. And I think it's critical that we bring our rural communities along with this in our rural areas. While we want to incentivize compact density, there are still people who are gonna want single family homes in a rural area. That is just part of Vermont's appeal. But if they wanna do it, this compromise is build 4 houses on fewer than 2,000 feet of driveway. So you're not going up into a forest. And you can do that without triggering Act 250. Now you still have all of the other state and local regulations and permitting that exist. But right now, we're saying the under 10 within 5 years, within 5 miles is avoiding anyways, but there's no road rule. So this is pushing for compact development in those rural areas. While we're also saying in these growth areas, and that's where we need the mapping to come along and the designation 2050 piece to come along with this study. Let's really push for where we want those 40 to 80,000 units of housing to make sure our seniors, new Vermonters, and our current Vermonters have a place to live and grow their families.
You mentioned new Vermonters, they can be coming from anywhere. Tom Cavett had an interesting statistic that he presented
Yeah.
that I've seen that we have the lowest rate of
We do.
immigrants coming to Vermont, which is interesting for a state that had different waves of immigrants coming, for instance, all of people of Polish and Italian origin, for instance, that came to the grain industry. So you know why it is that
Very engaged on how we can attract and retain more people to Vermont. And we know that that a lot of that needs to come from immigration. And so we need to be ready to do that. We work with our members on how to what they need to do to bring in new Americans, and there are some great companies in the state that do really good work on this, who are talking about the practices that they have on working with new Americans. But housing continues to be a challenge. We had one member in Chittenden County who hired 4 new Americans to work in their facility. And after 10 years, these 4 individuals had risen through the ranks in the company, were in management positions, and we're Vermonters and wanted to stay here, wanted to find homes close to each other where they could raise their families. And they looked at what was available, and there was a few 1970s raised ranches for $450,000. And then they looked in Ohio and they found homes next to each other that were $400,000 that were new. And so they moved. And so that was between those employees and their families, that was 10 new Americans and 10 Vermonters that we lost as part of an integral part of our community, as part of an integral piece of that business, because we couldn't accommodate their housing needs. So we are helping to elevate the Declaration of Inclusion. In our work, we host the website for the Declaration of Inclusion and can speak about it. We're at, I think, 73% of all Vermont's population live in the town where the Declaration has been adopted. That's certainly part of our work.
Thank you, Chair Bray. Have you spoken to your membership at all about the value of increased wages as it relates to access to housing?
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken to them, but they also know that increased wages is part of what has happened because of the labor market. So when we're talking about housing, or when we're talking about just the need for labor in general, and I think if you look at where wages have gone in Vermont over the past 5 years, they have drastically increased.
It's awesome.
So wages are way up.
Oh,
In Vermont, and I can send you the DOL data behind that.
that'd be great. Yeah, I saw something conflicting with that the Public Assets Institute had put out as it relates to other New England states and how we're actually the lowest when it comes to raising wages. In New England, but so I'd love to see.
Yeah, I'll send you what we have.
Going to trees and.
Yeah, well, and I'd say Vermont has majority of small business owners. You know, when you think about who are the businesses that can have middle management and upper management outside of the ownership and entry level, those are going to be medium to large businesses. And we have a few of those, but we don't have a lot of those. So it creates some of those ladders aren't available. But when they are available, we want those businesses to be part of our community, and we want people who work them to have an option. We know that there are businesses who have presence in Vermont and a presence in Texas, and they tell their employees, you can work in either of those. We'd love to have you in Vermont, but you choose. Same pay rate, and they pick Texas because they can find a house. And so it's a challenge, but we're happy to be part of this compromise and to stick up for it and answer any questions.
Great, well, thank you. I'm guessing that, well, for me, it's a little bit of times have changed when the statewide chamber can't even help on first spot, fragmentation, habitat, borders, so.
Well, we love when our environmental friends are talking about the need for house.
Yeah.
So I think it was a great process. I'm sure we put some of the steering, some of the facilitation group, into a 3 martini type of evening for some of the strategies we had. But I think we all ended in a good place.
So thank you very much. Sounds like a very Friday comment. Then we have, Jay Green join us.
Yes, I did notice that, that Mr. Gill was on the,
He's already
oh, okay, great, thank you. Just didn't wanna jump in, cut in line open. Okay, thank
So
you.
yeah, please join us. And let me ask you a question I'm always learning on this committee. I always refer to everyone who comes in by title or Mr. or Ms. So what, and I see you have a pronouns.
Yeah, I
What
remember.
pronoun should I be using in front of your last name?
Oh, sure. So thank you for that question. So for the record, my name is Jay Green. I'm the policy and research analyst for the Office of Racial Equity. I use they them pronouns. I go by mix, which is a, it's more commonly used in the UK than it is in the US, but I think it's a cool gender neutral way of referring to myself. First name or policy and research analyst is totally fine.
Okay, well, thank you. Just always learning on the fly.
Yes, thank you.
And so you've heard all the conversation, well, a lot of the conversation this morning, and we'd love to hear from your office.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you so much, and let me know if you have trouble understanding me, I can take my mask off, tis the season for respiratory illnesses, so I'm trying to keep it on. Great, thank you so much, so, yes, our office, was part of the steering committee, Executive Director Davis participated in the majority of the meetings, and I participated as her proxy when she was unavailable. I wanted to thank you all for the opportunity to testify on this important subject for the future of Vermont land use policy and consequently our housing market. I also really appreciated Megan Sullivan's comments on the need for adequate housing for workforce development because the youngest generation of Vermonters and the people moving into Vermont are more likely to be people of color than the current resident population. The short version of my comments on behalf of the office is that we need to be deliberate in how the governance of Act 250 includes or excludes people in the community from participating in these important decisions that affect our natural resources and our housing availability. As a reminder, our office's purview is addressing and dismantling systemic racism in state government's operations. Therefore, I wanted to take some time to focus our office's testimony on section 5 of the report, which is on page 13, which is the Natural Resources Board governance analysis and recommendations. I wanted to mention that as every other witness has said, that all of the updates in this report are presented as a package, and that includes the professionalization of the Natural Resources Board discussed in section 5 and appendix 3. And our office's testimony is not going to be about which of the 3 options presented you should choose. That Executive Director Davis doesn't see that as our role, and we don't have strong opinion on that. Rather we want to discuss why these updates to the Natural Resources Board governance processes are necessary and the considerations that the legislature should be taking into account when choosing an option. We have some racial equity related concerns with how many important government operations in Vermont are supported in whole or in part by volunteers and part-time staff without benefits. That creates an equity and opportunity for participating in state governance processes. This is really illustrated well by Executive Director Davis's 2024 report to the legislature, which was released this past Monday, the 15th. And so I'm going to read a quote from the 2024 Executive Director of Racial Equity's report. Quote.
And could you send that report to our committee?
Oh, absolutely,
Well,
yeah,
circulate it.
I'll submit a written copy of these comments that will include links to the Executive Director's reports and such. It's already been submitted to the, I believe the Government Operations Committee has received the report, so yeah, thank you. Yes, so here's the quote from the legislature, from the Executive Director's report. Vermont finds itself in a difficult stage. It is a small state with a high civic engagement and very accessible state government, so it has historically been able to accomplish a great deal of intensive policy work through the low cost or no cost labor of work group members and quote citizen legislators, unquote. However, over the years, the volume of research, drafting, deliberation, public engagement, investigation, and convening has grown substantially. so has the opportunity cost for performing those activities. As a result, that increased burden creates disparity in who can afford to be civically engaged and who's not, especially when work groups seeks more diversity in their membership, yet call upon the same dozen well-known people and organizations to represent the needs of historically marginalized groups. Despite the increased need for this important work, the state does not currently appear to be financially equipped to be able to afford to hire or meaningfully compensate those civically engaged community members whose service on state boards and commissions has fueled important policy and budget transformation. Put plainly, the state is too large to keep relying on volunteers to keep government going, yet too small to be able to pay for what the work is truly worth. One wonders how many members of state-created work groups would have vested in the state pension by now if the hours they contributed had been deemed staff hours instead of committee appointment service. And that's from page 11 of the report.
That's a pretty good report.
I have so much respect and admiration for Executive Director Davis's writing. So there are structural conditions that are created by this reliance on unpaid labor in many different boards, commissions, advisory councils, et cetera. We've seen anecdote and observed that the people who are able to participate in boards, commissions, advisory bodies, et cetera, tend to be independently wealthy or retired, or people who are able to afford childcare or whose children are grown and independent. And that is, they don't experience the structural barriers to participation that are imposed by a history of racially discriminatory access to high-income employment, housing, and childcare. The United States has a history of selectively imposing discrimination. Let me start over. The U.S. has a history of selectively imposing discriminatory structural barriers to public governance on the base of race, and Vermont is not an exception to the history of racial bias and discrimination, which continues in overt and less obvious systemic forms today. This executive director of racial equity position, and then later the Office of Racial Equity, was created to dismantle this existing systems of racism and in state government. So the considerations for this committee and for the legislature at large when looking at the Natural Resources Board governance updates. First, we want to caution against looking only at the budget estimates and the dollar figures. The office recommends instead that the legislature consider how much work is needed to meet the Natural Resource Board's needs for the updated Act 250 program, and rather than starting with sort of what budget numbers are most appealing. This consideration should not be how much government processes that the state is willing to pay for, but how much government processes are needed to meet the Natural Resources Board's needs to support the new updates to Act 250. Second, we also wanted to ask the legislature and legislators to consider whether the workload is commensurate with pay and designation as part-time. Is the workload actually part-time? And we suggest that you discuss further with the Natural Resource Board, district commissioners, and other staff with experience what workload the Act 250 updates are likely to impose in the future, and what staff or budget supports are needed to make sure that the Natural Resources Board can meet those needs. Our office has previously testified on more equitable advice for creating work groups and advisory boards, and there's detailed testimony on that was given to the Summer Government Accountability Committee, and my written copy will have links to that if you're interested in reading more. Yeah, and that is the end of my current written comments. I'm happy to take any questions that the committee has. But basically just wanted to highlight how important it is that as we are looking at this package of updates, we are adequately resourcing the Natural Resources Board so that people from every background and whoever is interested in participating in state governance and making these important decisions have the opportunity to do so in an equitable way.
Sure. So this committee has, I would say, for me, a somewhat troubling history around making a very genuine offer to operating areas that come in to say, tell us what you need for resource, and we will go to bat for you, which I think is a genuine offer. But we're not in charge of the budget and not faulting appropriations. When a request comes out of here, it is then has this, stand amongst 439 requests that appropriations is evaluating. So when we did the EJ bill, it left here, I'm off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember, but 2.7 million. And a significant portion of that was to help fund, so that we were relying less on people basically volunteering their time without pay, which is a well-known challenge for the state. Lots of people volunteering time when they may not be able to afford it. So when I am feeling it, I'm almost seeing like the same thing could happen again, where he's an entirely helpful way to say, what's all the work that needs to get done? NRB, and then what's the tab for doing that? And then can we go from that for winning appropriation that supports the work in a manner that doesn't leave people stressed out over, for instance, when you say part-time. I would say every legislator has a very keen sense of what a quote unquote part-time job can do to the rest of your life, time demands, and I'm sure a lot of other people do. So I don't know the answer here, but I want to acknowledge that there is this challenge that we face, and I have spoke to the chair of appropriations and the pro tem earlier this week about when we make a recommendation, take on certain tasks, and the bill leaves here and it gets less funding than we deemed necessary to implement that program well, that we need a mechanism then to follow back up and say, well, we are shortening your task list and managing the expectations that go with that bill to fit the funding provided, because otherwise we incrementally stress people by stretching it further and further and further each time we fail to fully fund something. So I'm fessing up to something that we haven't figured out yet. And the last little bit of challenge is that so much of this happens in the final days of the session where things are being added, subtracted, that I'm not sure the mechanism we would use to true up the to-do list of a bill with the actual funding that it receives, in kind of real time and keep up with the budget process. So I'm sharing that as a challenge for all of us in the room to think about so that we maximize everyone's opportunity for success and do it in a way that's not stressing people out. So.
Thank you very much. I think that we're exactly on the same page with regards to the difficulties of asking people to work quote unquote part-time, and that our office previously participated in the Racial Equity Task Force, and the second Racial Equity Task Force report did mention that it would create a more racially equitable system of governance if legislators received compensation and benefits for their work. So our office is definitely actively participating in that conversation about appropriate compensation for labor provided. And it sounds to me like maybe I should speak with Executive Director Davis about doing more testimony and appropriations this year. So that's the takeaway that I'm taking.
Well, thanks, and I'd love to follow up with you and Director Davis to keep that conversation going, because I feel like I have more to learn. Senator White, then Senator Watts.
Thank you, Chair Bray, and thank you, Mixed Green. My question relates to that conversation of adequate funding as it relates to the types of projects that have traditionally gone through the NRB process. And if you felt that if there were any comments you would make about how different applicants are faring in the process, as it relates to maybe the income of the person or the organization or developer proposing the project versus, let's say, more of a small or less, I would say, maybe like a large company versus a small company, or a large outfit versus a small outfit. Did you find that there was any relevant comments you wanted to share with us as the actual applicants going through the process and some of the changes that were put forward in the report?
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't personally have the experience or data to comment on the specific, if there are any disparities in sort of, who can or cannot go through the Act 250 process. It is clearly a very expensive process. I think the challenge comes when we're talking about, companies and like development companies versus, our office doesn't always, weigh in or comment on, sorry, I'm like, I'm
No,
having
it's
trouble
fine.
formulating a response, it's a challenging question, so. Our office supports increased growth of, businesses owned by people of color and more business opportunities for people of color. I think that this would probably be a great topic for, maybe some of the folks at the Vermont Professionals of Color Network to speak to, about whether, they have had, whether people in their network have experienced challenges with Act 250 based on, race and ethnicity, or if there are disparities in how, person of color owned companies are treated by, district commissioners or structural barriers in the Act 250 process. But I think that's a great question. I just can't off the top of my head answer it for you.
Well, that's totally reasonable. We also have a copy of The Color of Law in this room, which was, I think, I don't know if we considered it required reading before the term, but I had an opportunity to spend some time with it last year. And one of the things that makes me both feel a lot of tension with Act 250, but also understand how we can, why we need changes, was based off of my reflections from that book, and how some of the ways that we talk about excluding certain types of growth can just be a dog whistle for we don't want Black and brown people in this part of town. So I'm wondering if those types of discussions came up through the process, and if you felt that there was anything you'd like to share about that angle to it, because it's not, while I do appreciate the foundation that Act 250 has in protecting our environmental resources, there is also a tension for me with how it was used as a way to perpetuate whiteness in our state. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I think, thank you for raising the issue of historical discrimination based on race and ethnicity, and it is my suspicion, based on the research and reading I've done about Act 250, that one of the collateral consequences, if not the intent of Act 250, was that it largely excluded, people who were not independently wealthy enough to build their own homes in ways that get around Act 250 from moving to the state, becoming homeowners, and that it may have contributed to the current disparity that we see, where 70% of white Vermonters own their homes compared to, I believe the numbers are something like 20% of Black Vermonters. So I think that it's impossible to consider those statistics without thinking about the policy landscape that created them. Which is, I think that there's a lot to discuss there. It's a rich topic for more discussion about the ways that housing policy does or does not create inclusion and exclusion based on race. And I think the other thing I would want to say is that I'm trying to channel Susanna here, but we don't want to stereotype people that all people of color need affordable housing, but we also want to acknowledge that systemic and structural barriers have created the conditions where people of color are disproportionately excluded from things like banking, generational wealth development throughout the history of this country. So oftentimes, that the discussions around affordable housing are going to benefit everyone regardless of race, and they will also benefit the disproportionately high numbers of people of color who are experiencing generational poverty because of the history of systemic racism. That was a lot of very large words in a very long.
No,
I hope that was clear.
It made complete sense to me, and were there discussions on that topic throughout the process?
Oh, yes,
Okay.
I certainly, in the meetings that I participated in, I brought up that we needed to be looking at all of these policies with a racial equity lens and a lens towards, it's just challenging to predict how these Act 250 updates will affect the availability of sort of the missing middle housing, the low income housing, all of that. So, yeah, that was the lens that our office brought to this session.
Thank you.
So Victoria, so thanks so much for coming in and, this to me suggests we'd love to have your office come in for another full conversation around natural resources more broadly, not just Act 250. So, expect another invitation.
Thank you so much, yeah, and I would also like to echo, Mr. Foster's recommendation to speak with Carla Redmond, the Director of Environmental Justice and Civil Rights at Agency of Natural Resources. She is environmental justice law professional and has tremendous amount of experience in those topics as well.
So thank you again
Thank you so much.
for that. Mr. Roven, you're in the batting cleanup position, and I know that we're running a little short on time, but
I'll be quick.
I know you're good at it, and we're gonna see you again.
Yeah,
soon.
that's nice of you to say, I appreciate that. For the record, John Groveman, I'm the policy and water program director for the Vermont Natural Resources Council. So I'm not gonna, you heard a lot, I'm just gonna amplify some of the things that you saw, that you heard today, but I just wanna say at the outset, so I represented VNRC on the NRB steering committee. And I really do wanna, applaud the NRB for the work it did. It did a great job. I think Billy Costa said it really well. It was a diverse group, and Megan as well. I mean, we spent a lot of time together this summer and fall. It was a lot of meetings. And we really dug into it. The consultants were great. I think they should get a lot of credit for keeping people on track. But as Billy said, this report came from us, and it was after a lot of debate about the words and the approach. So I think, we came here last year, VNRC, and with the housing bill that was before you, we said, let's be rational and deliberate, and we have these reports coming from the NRB, from the RPC. Let's make sure that we're growing where we want to in the right way. And those reports, we felt would really guide us, and I think they have. And so I think that this is a continuation of the story. So as you heard, the core of, I think, the recommendations is these jurisdictional changes. And I really think it's a big deal. As Megan said, VNRC recognizes we have a housing crisis. And I really appreciate Megan saying that Act 250 did not cause this housing crisis and won't solve it entirely. But I think everything that we can do to make Act 250 work better, to recognize that there are some municipalities that have high quality zoning and subdivision, and they have really good land use programs. And you take that and you combine it with the mapping that the RPCs are going to do, it makes sense to basically not duplicate efforts. And we could let the local zoning in those situations really govern development, in particular housing in those areas. And it'll be based on mapping and an evaluation of those zoning programs and the accountability that Peter Gregory talked about. I think it's really important that the proposal is for a state board to kind of, the RPCs will do the planning. There'll be an evaluation of the local zoning programs, and then there's gonna be a state board that's gonna sort of ordain all that and then adopt a map. And within those mapped areas, it makes sense that that's where we should not duplicate regulations and grow. And just as importantly, on the other side of the ledger, the same exact effort is gonna go on with regard to critical resources. So the RPCs working with ANR will also identify critical resources. They will be mapped. They will go through a state board, and when the decision is made that these are critical resources that require additional protection Act 250 will apply in those areas. It doesn't mean they're not like class 1 wetlands, doesn't mean no development, but just means you get, as I think Peter Gill said, you're gonna go through the process, you're gonna go through the criteria of Act 250. Really important point that hasn't come up is the report is clear that we want to move forward with both of these tiers at the same time. So we wanna be working to implement tiers 1A and 1B, where we're gonna have our exemptions, and also tier 3 at the same time. So there's a lot of work ahead if you all approve a bill that's, you know, that's as recommended in the NRB report. So we want to do both of these things. I really appreciated your questions about like what other resources are they, high quality waters that came up in the steering committee. We talked about headwaters and the class A waters that we did last session. We talked about forest blocks, significant forest blocks. We talked about habitat connector areas and travel corridors. Talked about all of those things, but as you heard, the report really recommends that we need to create a process to identify these areas and have a discussion based on data, based on science, on what they will be. And VNRC supports that. You know, it's a difficult, you know, it's not going to be easy. It's super important. As you hear testimony, you know, think about what the legislation should say with regard to these resource areas, but where the report landed is that it should be a bottom up debate through the process that we create. But all the resources you mentioned were the ones that we talked about, and we did talk about whether we should list them or not, and at the end of the day, we didn't, because it was hard to get total agreement on once you start listing things.
Yeah,
To be quite candid.
I just want to double check what I thought I heard you
Yeah.
saying. You're recommending moving ahead with both 1A and 1B and tier 3. Are you not saying tier 2?
Oh, no, I'll get to tier 2, yeah. Well, tier 2 doesn't require, I mentioned the tier 1 and 3 because those require a process. And they require mapping and they require approval from a state board. Tier 2 doesn't. Tier 2 is the road rule, basically. The difference is the road rule. And I really appreciate ANR and the chamber acknowledging, you know, support for the road rule, for the fragmentation criteria that I think you all have passed 7 times or something like that, but it's not in the law. I think we've come a long way, you know, and I think the people who worked on that, people like Jamie Fidel and others who toiled for years, it's really heartening to see through this really excellent NRB process, kind of support for both exemptions for where we don't want to duplicate and grow, but also we need to do a better job of protecting our intact forests and have that criteria and the road rule. I do want to note that I agree it's a package. The report is a package and VNRC supports the package, but the report we did have a big debate about, so the road rule is the 2,000 feet of roads and driveways cumulatively triggering Act 250. The report does note that there was a discussion about, do we need a single road trigger? I think that's what you were kind of referencing earlier. There was not agreement on that, so I absolutely, but the report does reference that there was discussion in some groups, not surprisingly, VNRC was one of those groups, for saying we should also have a single road trigger. But that was not the recommendation, and there was no length of the road, but I do think that there was contemplation that the legislature will discuss that, you know, whether that's needed or not. So I just wanted to note that. Also in tier 2, I wanted to just pick up on the questions about sprawl from Peter Gregory, because it was a really excellent discussion. I think tier 2 is that's where we see most of the sprawl. And so VNRC actually, because along with the RPCs, we were a big proponent of criteria 9L. That's the criteria in Act 250 that addresses sprawl. We've been analyzing over the last 5 years, looking at applications, how is Act 250 done? So we have data and analysis on that. We think it's not been a great story in terms of controlling sprawl. I don't want to get down that rabbit hole, but we're happy to come in and present some of the analysis that we've done on that, because they're good questions. It's not really part of the study, and it wasn't an issue that we really focused on in terms of these recommendations for improving Act 50, but we have done work on that and happy to discuss that.
I have
When we get into it.
PTSD from that work.
Yeah, it's fair enough, many of us do. So with regard to, you heard about the governance recommendations in the report. I couldn't agree more. With Jay Green focusing on that, I think the nub of the recommendation is what Jay indicated, which is, and I think what you noted, like having volunteers basically implementing such an important program. And it's just in the 2024, it's not, I was the chair of the NRB. We would have new board members come on the board. You could say the same for district commissioners, which are not addressed in the report. They are also essentially volunteered, and they actually do the permitting work. They get the same $50 a day compensation, but I know it's a bigger issue. But VNRC really supports professionalizing the NRB. We agree it'll have all the benefits that Chair Haskell indicated. We do want to note that, and this came up, but you're talking about the tiers, someone needs to make the decision on the tiers, on the tier 1 and tier 3. We think it makes sense for it to be the new professional NRB. If you're going to invest in the NRB, that you're going to have to choose somebody to do that work. And, that's not specifically recommended in the report, but I don't think there would be opposition to it. And I think that makes sense to us. It is absolutely correct that there was no consensus reached on appeals. VNRC for years have advocated that we should move Act 50 appeals to a professional board. If you take up that issue, we're happy to, we've analyzed that as well. We have data because comparing the old environmental board to the court in terms of the efficiency and effectiveness of dealing with appeals. So, that's not recommended in the report, but, that's something that if you wanted to explore, we're happy to provide information to.
Does it recommend moving all majors right to the board?
No. Really, it's professionalize the board, so it'll be better, in a better position to basically oversee and administer the program, which we completely agree with. And silent on appeals and silent on whether the new board should hear these designations. As I said, I think this is really not controversial about the designations, because someone's got to do it. So we got to pick somebody. You could do nothing on appeals, you could change appeal. That is more discretionary. We think it's important, but more discretionary. But if you're going to go with this approach, you got to choose someone to get these designations. And if you're going to professionalize the NRB, we think it makes sense that it should be them. And lastly, I just want to note that I do think that it is, there was the governor's press conference last week on his housing bill, and it really is a different approach. This is an approach that's based on, I think Peter Gregory says, based on planning. It was based on a stakeholder process with public input. The recommendations are based on land use mapping and planning that is going to be done by the RPC in conjunction with A&R, accountability, approval by a board, so that it's not just any town with any type of zoning. I think as Peter Gregory noted, towns can adopt pretty minimal zoning and subdivision just to get higher Act 50 thresholds, and that will result in unintended consequences. And that is how we read the governor's bill, where we read this NRB recommendation would, drive the development where we want it, would require it really to be clustered, as Megan talked about, and dense, and you're going to get more, multifamily housing. Whereas an approach that doesn't have these safeguards, you could get, 30 units kind of spread out, sort of what you described that you saw in your drive from the Berkshire, then we don't want that. So I think this is a good approach that's based on a lot of thought, a lot of expertise, a lot of input, and it would be based on accountability and planning and mapping. And so I think that's just a big difference between the two approaches. And I think you hear a lot of support from this approach from a lot of other diverse stakeholders. So I think I'll leave it with that.
Well, I want to thank you and everyone who's come in this morning, all the members of your work. We won't see all of them firsthand since they're 16, but really appreciate the amount of thoughtful work that leads to potential implementation plan. sometimes we study things, but there's no implementation. This lays out a path forward.
Yeah, no, again, the NRB gets tremendous credit. They really did a great job and somehow got us all to work through the summer. It was a flood, and then we were like, we were getting break.
Yes, we are adjourned.